A plate shatters against the tile floor of a small diner in Pinebrook, Vermont, and for one long second the whole room goes quiet. Claire Dawson presses her hand flat against her stomach. Her breath catches. Nobody around her has any idea that her whole life is about to bend in a direction she never saw coming. At a corner booth near the frosted window sits a man she's never met before, and his eyes stay on her a beat too long. What happens between them in the next few minutes changes not just her future, but the future of a stranger who has already lost more than anyone in that diner could guess. Before we go any further, if stories like this one pull at something in you, go ahead and hit subscribe on Winter Veil and drop a like. It only takes a second, and it genuinely helps this channel keep going. And now settle in, because the ending to this one is not what you think it's going to be. Winter has always felt like the season of quiet mercy to me. The way snow settles over a hard year and makes it, for a little while, look soft. When I wrote Claire's story, I kept thinking about that first snowfall that hides everything ugly underneath it, at least for a night, and how sometimes the coldest month of someone's life is exactly when the smallest kindness lands the hardest. I hope you feel a little of that warmth in the cold tonight. Claire was 28 years old and 6 months pregnant when her life started coming apart at the seams. She and her husband Ryan had met 5 years earlier at a bar off Main Street on an ordinary October night, both of them waiting too long for the same bartender, and what started as a joke about the wait turned into 3 hours of talking that neither of them wanted to end. They got married 2 years later in a small ceremony behind her parents' house. Nothing fancy, because both of them had already decided that all they needed to be happy was each other. Ryan worked as a mechanic at Colton's garage on the edge of town, a broad-shouldered man with dark hair and a crooked smile that made even bad days feel survivable. Every night, he rested his hand on the curve of Claire's belly and murmured something to the baby who wasn't due for another few months. And in those small moments, nothing in the world felt like it could touch them. They lived in a narrow rented house 2 streets back from the garage, nothing special to look at, but warm in a way that had nothing to do with the furnace. A second-hand crib already stood half-assembled in the corner of the spare room, and a row of blurry ultrasound photos was taped to the wall by their bed, the ones Claire looked at every night before she fell asleep. Then came the morning that knocked all of it sideways. Ice had crept over the garage floor overnight, and when Ryan climbed onto the hydraulic lift to check a transmission, the thing gave out from under him without warning, dropping him hard onto the concrete and snapping his arm in 2 places on the way down. His coworkers got him to the hospital within the hour, where the doctor told them the recovery would take months, maybe longer, and there was a real chance he'd never get full strength back in that arm. When Claire saw him lying pale on the gurney, his face twisted with pain, he was trying not to show her. She felt a fear settle into her chest that went deeper than anything she'd known before. She held his good hand the whole way into surgery, whispering to herself that it was going to be fine, that it had to be fine. The nightmare didn't end with the surgery, because Ryan's employer refused outright to file it as a workplace injury. The shop owner claimed the lift had been serviced on schedule and insisted Ryan must have made some careless mistake of his own, a claim that made every mechanic on that floor furious, because they all knew exactly how many times that lift had jammed in the past month alone. The insurance company let the days stretch into weeks without giving a straight answer, and Ryan, a man who used to be all restless energy, now sat at home with his arms strapped across his chest, unable to do the simplest things for himself. His frustration built with every day he had to watch his pregnant wife carry the weight of both their lives on her own shoulders. Claire watched her husband fold in on himself a little more each week, and she knew that one of them had to bring in money no matter how hard it had become to move through her days with a belly that kept growing rounder. Their savings thinned out fast, bills piled up on the kitchen counter, and rent didn't wait around for an insurance company to make up its mind. With her stomach far enough along that she had to be careful how she stood, Claire walked into a small diner downtown, called the Maple Street Diner, and asked if they were hiring. The owner, a gruff, impatient man named Frank Doyle, hired her on the spot without asking a single question about how far along she actually was. From that day forward, Claire wore loose flannel shirts and tied her apron a little looser than it needed to be, terrified that Doyle would let her go the moment he realized the truth. She didn't want anyone's pity, she just wanted to keep the job, because every single dollar mattered twice as much now. And without that paycheck, neither of them had any idea how they'd get through the next month. Every morning she woke early, made Ryan coffee that he had to hold with his good hand, and walked the cold sidewalks to work while the gray Vermont sky pressed low over the rooftops. She had learned to ignore the ache in her swollen feet, because quitting was never something she let herself consider. A coworker at the diner named Megan was the only one who knew Claire was pregnant, having noticed by accident one afternoon when Claire had to grab the edge of the counter to steady herself. Megan swore she wouldn't say a word, but she warned Claire more than once that Doyle wouldn't show an ounce of mercy if he found out, since he'd already pushed two other pregnant waitresses out the door without a second thought. That warning sat heavy on Claire's chest, and every time she walked through those diner doors, she forced a smile onto her face no matter how tired or scared she felt underneath it. The shifts were long, the trays were heavy, the customers were often short-tempered, but Claire kept going because she knew two people back home were counting on her. In the evenings, Claire and Ryan sat together on the couch, his good hand resting on her belly, talking each other into a little more courage even though both of them knew exactly how thin the ice under them had gotten. Ryan tried to help however he could, washing dishes one-handed, hanging laundry the best way he was able, but every small task cost him twice the effort it used to, and that wore on him in a way that made him quiet some nights. Their love for each other was the one thing that hadn't shifted through all of this, even as almost everything else in their life seemed to be sliding out from under their feet. Some nights, when Claire couldn't sleep because the baby was kicking, she thought about how easy their life used to feel and how quickly all of it had turned. Some nights Ryan sat at the kitchen table long after Claire had gone to bed, staring at the stack of unopened envelopes with the insurance company's return address printed across the corner, as if staring hard enough might change what was written inside them. He hated feeling useless more than he hated the ache in his arm, and more than once Claire found him there in the dark at 2 in the morning, not sleeping, just sitting with his jaw tight and his eyes somewhere far away. She would sit down beside him without a word, rest her head against his good shoulder, and remind him softly that they were still standing, that a broken arm and a hard month didn't erase who they were to each other. Those quiet kitchen mornings became their own strange kind of ritual, one neither of them ever spoke about out loud, but one that kept them both from breaking under the weight of it. One morning, while a light snow drifted past the diner windows and dusted the parked cars along Main Street, a sharp cramp cut through Claire's stomach so suddenly that she had to grab the counter to keep from going down. Megan rushed over, her face pale with worry, but Claire waved her off and whispered that she was fine, desperate not to draw attention, especially not from Doyle, who happened to be standing just a few feet away restocking the register. At a window booth nearby sat a man in a dark wool coat who had been quietly watching every one of Claire's movements for the last several minutes, though she hadn't noticed him yet. His gaze wasn't the kind that made her skin crawl. It was something closer to quiet concern, as if he'd already understood that something was wrong with this young woman long before anyone else in the room had. The man was tall, somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair combed neatly back and a strong, clean jawline, and dark brown eyes that carried a surprising warmth despite the expensive, perfectly tailored coat he wore. He had the look of someone used to walking into a room and being noticed immediately, but that morning his attention wasn't on his own reputation at all. It was entirely on the young waitress fighting through her own exhaustion in front of him. When Claire finally steadied herself and came over to take his order, he studied her for a moment longer than he should have before asking gently whether she was pregnant and whether she was truly all right. Claire froze for half a second, her pulse jumping, before she forced a smile and told him everything was fine. She'd just felt a little lightheaded, nothing more. The stranger didn't push. He simply gave his order in a calm, easy voice and let her return to the kitchen, though his eyes followed her a beat longer than they needed to. The second she was out of sight, Claire leaned against the wall of the back hallway and finally let the tears fall that she had been holding back all morning. The pregnancy, the worry over Ryan, the fear of Doyle finding out the truth, all of it crashed down on her in that one quiet moment, and she found herself wondering, in a whisper only she could hear, how much longer she could keep carrying all of it. After a minute, she wiped her face dry, pulled in a long breath, and forced herself back onto the floor as if nothing had happened, because she couldn't afford to look weak. Not now. Not with a baby on the way. Doyle, who had clocked the short delay, shot her a sharp look as she passed and muttered something about not paying people to take bathroom breaks. When the stranger finished his meal and walked up to the register to pay, he slid a small card across the counter to Claire without a word, one that had been sitting under his coffee cup the whole time. He told her quietly that she should call him if she ever needed help, any kind of help at all, and then he walked out into the snow that had started falling harder, the door swinging shut behind him. Claire tucked the card into her apron pocket without giving it much thought and went back to clearing the table, since her shift was far from over and Doyle was already watching her too closely. It wasn't until that evening, when she finally sat down exhausted on the couch, that she remembered the card and pulled it out to look at it properly under the lamplight. The card read Ethan Marsh, attorney at law, with an office address downtown, and beneath the printed text a short handwritten note saying he'd be glad to help if she was having any trouble at work or with her pregnancy. Claire showed it to Ryan, who turned it over in his fingers for a long moment before guessing that the man had probably assumed something worse was going on, maybe that she was being mistreated or pressured at her job. After all, Claire had gone to such lengths to hide her belly that a careful observer like that might easily have read the wrong story into it. Ryan and Claire looked at each other for a long time, unsure whether they could really trust a total stranger, but their situation had grown desperate enough that they didn't feel like they had much of a choice except to try. The next evening, after a long silence and a quiet conversation at the kitchen table, Claire dialed the number on the card, her fingers trembling slightly as it rang. Ethan Marsh answered in a calm, friendly voice, and Claire carefully explained that there had probably been some kind of misunderstanding, that things at work were actually fine. She'd just been overwhelmed for a moment. Ethan listened closely and then said gently that he understood she was going through something difficult. He'd seen it on her face, even though she'd tried hard to hide it from him. Encouraged by how easy he was to talk to, Claire found herself telling him hesitantly about Ryan's accident, about the insurance company stalling for weeks, about the bills stacking up on their counter, and Ethan took in every word with growing concern. When Claire admitted that they couldn't possibly afford a lawyer, Ethan cut her off immediately and told her firmly that this wasn't something she needed to worry about at all. He suggested that she and Ryan come by his office the next day so he could look into the situation properly. No obligation, no cost of any kind. Claire hung up the phone and looked at Ryan, who wore the same mixture of hope and suspicion she felt herself, because things like this simply didn't happen, not in their world. Why would a total stranger want to help them without asking for anything in return? They both wondered, while the streetlights outside flickered faintly through the falling snow. The next morning, Claire and Ryan made their way downtown to an address that turned out to be a large, respected law firm with a glass front and a name etched in gold letters above the entrance. Both of them felt small walking through the lobby, surrounded by marble floors and lawyers in sharp suits hurrying past with folders tucked under their arms. A receptionist glanced briefly at Claire's plain winter coat before smiling politely and leading them up to a spacious office on the top floor, where Ethan Marsh was already waiting, dressed sharply, with a warm, genuine smile on his face. He offered them something to drink, pulled 2 chairs closer to his desk, and asked Ryan calmly to walk him through exactly what had happened over the past few weeks. Ryan began speaking, his voice rough and hesitant at first, then steadier as he described the fall from the lift, the sharp pain in his arm, his employer's refusal to acknowledge the accident, and the endless weeks of waiting on the insurance company for an answer that never came. Ethan listened with total focus, his expression growing more serious with every detail, and you could almost see the legal strategy taking shape behind his eyes as his pen moved steadily across a legal pad. When Ryan finished, Ethan leaned back and said plainly that what his employer had done clearly violated basic labor law and absolutely could not be allowed to stand unchallenged. He explained that the company was simply trying to dodge responsibility to save money, and that wasn't something he could let sit quietly, not once he'd heard the whole story. Ethan made it clear he wanted to take the case, and that neither of them needed to worry about the cost, because he would handle everything that needed to be done. Ryan, who had stayed quiet for most of the meeting, finally asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the phone call. "Why would you do this for us? You don't know us." Ethan went quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, before he said that he and his wife Hannah had been married 5 years, and, despite several rounds of fertility treatment, had never been able to have a child of their own. "When I saw your wife at that diner," he said, looking at Ryan now, "still working through it, not complaining, not giving up, it got to me. A kid means everything to me. Always has." He told them that he and Hannah had converted the nursery they'd painted years ago back into a home office after the third round of treatment failed, because neither of them could stand walking past that closed door every morning. He said it quietly, without asking for sympathy, the way a person talks about an old scar that doesn't hurt anymore, but never quite fades either. Claire felt tears rising in her eyes as Ethan kept talking, explaining that he'd recognized something in her story he couldn't just look away from, a kind of strength he genuinely admired. He said that the two of them had ended up in this impossible situation through no fault of their own, only because other people had been careless and indifferent, and that wasn't something anyone should simply have to accept. Ryan stood up, visibly moved, and shook Ethan's hand with a voice that cracked slightly, while Ethan was already jotting down notes and mapping out his next move. From that moment forward, Ethan wasn't just going to be their lawyer. He was going to be someone who helped them believe in a better future again, on a day that had started with almost no hope at all and ended with a small spark of it. The very next day, Ethan sent an official letter to Ryan's former employer, stating plainly that he was fully prepared to take the case to court and make every safety violation public if it came to that. The shop owner panicked reading it, because Ethan Marsh's name carried real weight in the local business world when it came to labor disputes, and nobody wanted to face him in front of a judge. Instead of settling quickly, the employer first tried to downplay the whole thing, having his own lawyer claim that Ryan had ignored safety procedures and was responsible for his own injury. Ethan wasn't rattled, and within days he'd gathered statements from Ryan's coworkers, all of whom confirmed that the lift had been reported as faulty for weeks with nobody ever fixing it. One of them, an older mechanic named Walt who'd worked at that garage for 2 decades, agreed to put it in writing that he'd personally flagged the same lift to the shop foreman 3 separate times without a single repair ever being made. Then, 4 days before the statement was due to be filed, Walt called Ryan late at night, his voice tight in a way Ryan had never heard from him before. "I can't do it," he said. "Foreman pulled me aside this morning. Told me if I go on record against the shop, I'm the next one who gets let go for cause. Doesn't matter that I've been there 20 years. Ryan stood in his kitchen gripping the phone, his stomach dropping, because Walt's statement was the strongest piece of evidence they had, and without it the case came down to Ryan's word against his old employers. "I got a mortgage, Ryan," Walt said, quieter now. "I got a wife. I can't lose this job over yours." Ryan told him he understood, and he meant it, but after he hung up he sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving, the fear that they were about to lose everything settling back over him like it never left. Ryan told Ethan the next morning, bracing for the case to fall apart right there in the phone call. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said it wasn't the end. It just meant they needed to change the shape of the fight. He drove out to see Walt himself that same afternoon, not as a lawyer building a case, but as one man talking to another, and he told Walt plainly that he could file the maintenance complaints under a whistleblower protection statute that made it illegal for the company to retaliate against him for testifying, and that if they tried, Ethan would go after them for that too, at his own expense. Walt sat with that for a long moment at his own kitchen table before he finally nodded and said if Ethan was willing to go that far for him, the least he could do was tell the truth. Walt even stopped by the Dawsons' house that weekend, putting a fatherly hand on Ryan's shoulder and telling him it was long past time somebody in that shop got held accountable before anyone else got hurt. That kind of loyalty moved Ryan more than he expected because he'd been bracing himself to fight the whole company alone, and for a few days there, he actually had been. Not everyone at Ethan's firm was thrilled about how much time he was pouring into the case. An older partner named Mr. Whitfield, who'd built half the firm's reputation over the decades, called Ethan into his office one afternoon. "Walk me through this," Whitfield said, not looking up from the file. "A mechanic and a pregnant waitress. What's the settlement even worth? 15,000? 20? You're burning partner-level hours on a case that'll never cover its own cost." Ethan said not every case should be measured by the invoice at the end of it, that sometimes doing right by someone mattered more than the number on a bill. Whitfield leaned back and said, in the tone of a man who'd watched 100 young lawyers make the same mistake, "Sentiment's expensive, Ethan. This firm has a reputation. I'd hate to see you spend it on something that'll never make the papers. If standing by two people who got wronged is bad for my reputation, Ethan said, then my reputation isn't worth much to begin with. Whitfield walked out shaking his head, but over the following weeks he watched from a distance as Ethan pushed the case forward with sharp, careful precision, never making a single misstep. When the settlement with the garage chain was finally announced, and a small mention of Ethan's efforts on behalf of an ordinary local worker even turned up in the town paper, Whitfield's whole attitude shifted overnight. He sought Ethan out that same day, shook his hand, and admitted he'd been wrong, because sometimes it was exactly this kind of case that defined a firm's real character, not the big corporate accounts. Once the employer realized his lies weren't holding up, and that Ethan genuinely intended to bring the evidence in front of a judge, he suddenly requested a private meeting with Ryan to settle things directly before the damage to his company's name got any worse. Ethan went along with Ryan to the meeting, held in the garage chain's own offices, a room with a laminate table and a window looking out on the plowed parking lot. The owner, a thin, nervous-looking man named Grady, didn't offer anyone coffee. 20 years this family's been running that shop, Grady started, looking mostly at Ryan. Your dad worked for us too, didn't he? You really want to be the guy who tears all that down over a piece of bad luck. Ryan felt the old pull to just nod and let it go, the way he might have done 6 months earlier. Instead, he said, it wasn't bad luck. Walt flagged that lift 3 times. You've got the maintenance logs to prove it. Grady's eyes flicked to Ethan and back. Loyalty's supposed to run both ways, Ryan added. I gave you 8 years. Doesn't seem like it bought me much. The owner couldn't hold his gaze after that, shifting in his chair as it slowly became clear to him that this wasn't a fight he was going to win. Ethan let the silence sit for a moment before he slid the folder across the table, the witness statements and the maintenance logs stacked neatly on top. Every day this drags on costs you more than a settlement would, he said, in the same even, unhurried tone he'd used in his office. You can keep pretending the paperwork doesn't say what it says, or we can finish this today. Grady rubbed his jaw, looked at the folder, looked at Ryan one more time, and then named a number nearly double what had been on the table before, just to close the whole thing out. Ryan walked out of that building with a feeling he hadn't had in months, plain satisfaction, while Ethan clapped him on the shoulder outside and told him how proud he was of the way he'd held his ground. When they told Claire about the meeting that evening, she could hardly believe how much her husband had changed in the last few weeks, from a broken, helpless man into someone walking through life upright again. Over the following days, the settlement was finalized in writing, and Ethan personally reviewed every clause of the agreement to make sure Ryan received the full amount owed to him, with no hidden terms or unnecessary delays buried in the fine print. The negotiations were officially closed, and for Claire and Ryan it felt as though their entire life had turned a corner in just a few short weeks. In the weeks that followed, Ethan stayed closely in touch with the small family, calling now and then just to check in, and every time he did, Claire felt her days grow a little lighter, even as her belly grew rounder and the due date crept closer. Ryan even started quietly looking into new jobs, because for the first time in months the future didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like something he could actually reach for again. The heaviness that had followed them through so many days seemed, slowly, to be lifting for good. Claire had to scale back her hours at the diner as her belly grew too large for even her loosest shirts to hide any longer, and one morning Doyle called her abruptly into his cramped little office behind the kitchen. He didn't ask her to sit down. "How far along are you?" he said, not really a question. Claire's stomach dropped, but she answered honestly, and Doyle nodded like he'd already made up his mind before she walked in. "I can't have a waitress going out on leave in the middle of the season," he said. "It's nothing personal. It's business. Firing me over this isn't legal, Frank," Claire said, her hands shaking at her sides. "You know that." Doyle let out a short laugh, the kind with no humor in it. "Prove it in court, then," he said. "See how far a waitress gets against a business owner who's lived in this town 30 years. He slid her final check across the desk without looking up and told her to clear out her locker before her shift ended, then went back to counting the register like the conversation had already cost him more time than she was worth. Claire walked out into the parking lot with her coat only half buttoned, the cold air hitting her face, and for one long moment she just stood there in the falling snow, not sure whether to cry or scream or just keep walking. That same night, Claire called Ethan with a trembling voice and told him through tears what had happened, convinced she was about to lose the one steady thing keeping her family afloat. Ethan listened quietly, and when she finished, he told her plainly that Doyle had just made a serious mistake because firing someone over a pregnancy was flatly illegal under Vermont law. That same night, he drafted another letter, this one addressed to the Maple Street Diner, stating in no uncertain terms that the termination wasn't just invalid. It could carry real legal consequences for the owner personally. When Doyle found that letter with the firm's letterhead sitting on his desk the next morning, his face went pale, and he called Claire that same afternoon to apologize awkwardly and assure her that her job was, of course, perfectly secure. Claire hung up the phone and allowed herself her first real, easy smile in weeks, while Ryan pulled her close and whispered that they'd made it through together, the two of them side by side. That small battle they had won felt like proof that with Ethan standing beside them, they weren't as powerless as they'd started to believe, no matter who tried to stand in their way. From that day forward, Doyle treated Claire with a kind of respect she'd never seen from him before, even letting her leave early on the days she was clearly worn out in the final stretch before the baby came. A few days later, the agreed settlement finally landed in Ryan's account. The overdue insurance payment combined with the additional compensation for his pain, his lost wages, and the brutal months the family had endured. When Ryan saw the confirmation pop up on his phone, he could barely believe it, and he called Claire immediately as she was walking out of the diner, both of them bursting into tears of relief right there on the sidewalk. For the first time in months, they didn't have to stretch every single dollar twice over, and the fear that had shaped their entire daily life finally started to melt away like the last patches of snow along the curb in early spring. Claire understood in that moment, with complete certainty, that she owed this stranger from the diner more than she could ever put into words, and that his walking through that door had been no accident at all. But life still had one more enormous change waiting for them, because Claire's due date was closing in fast, and their little rented house had slowly filled with everything a newborn would need: tiny socks folded in a drawer, a crib Ryan had wrestled together one-handed over several patient weekends. One evening, while a steady snow fell outside and blanketed the porch steps in white, Claire's contractions started early and hit harder than she'd expected. Ryan, his arms still not fully healed, grabbed the bag they'd packed weeks earlier and got her to the hospital as fast as the icy roads would allow, his voice cracking somewhere between excitement and fear. In the delivery room, he held her hand tightly, telling her over and over how strong she was while she pushed through contraction after contraction with her jaw clenched. The hours that followed were long and painful, with a few tense moments when the doctors frowned over the baby's position and the heart rate dipped in a way that made everyone in the room go quiet for a few frightening seconds. A nurse called out steady, calm instructions while Ryan stood at the edge of his own composure, unable to do anything but refuse to leave his wife's side for even a second. For one stretch of maybe 30 seconds, nobody in the room spoke at all, and Ryan felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter outside, a fear sharper than anything the last few months had thrown at him. Then the monitor steadied, the doctor nodded once, and the room seemed to breathe again, all at the same time. Claire pushed, breathed, pushed again, her strength nearly spent, but the thought of Ryan and of the small life she was about to meet gave her exactly the last bit of energy she needed. By the end of that long night, Claire held her healthy baby boy in her arms for the first time, exhausted and overjoyed, while outside the window the first gray light of morning began to soften the snow-covered rooftops of Pinebrook. A couple of days later, while Claire was still recovering in the hospital, there was a soft knock at the door, and Ethan Marsh walked in carrying a large bouquet of flowers and a warm, almost shy smile on his face. He'd heard about the birth and hadn't wanted to miss the chance to stop by in person and see the small piece of happiness he'd helped make possible. Ryan stood carefully and shook his hand with real gratitude, while Claire, her eyes glassy, told him that without him, they didn't know where they'd be right now. Maybe out on the street by now if things had gone differently. Ethan waved that off modestly, saying quietly that he'd only done what any decent person would have done once they'd seen the truth of the situation, nothing more than that. Claire looked over at Ryan, then back at Ethan, and with a tired but radiant smile said, "We already decided. Last night." His name is Ethan Dawson. For once in his life, Ethan seemed to run out of words. Drawing in a long breath while his eyes filled with tears, he made no effort to hide this time. He took the small boy carefully into his arms, studied his tiny face for a long moment, and said quietly, "This one's going to grow up in a home full of love." There's nothing I could have wished for more than that. In that quiet hospital room, the fates of three people bound themselves together for good. Three lives that had found each other through nothing but chance, real compassion, and a little snow. In the weeks that followed, Ethan came by often to visit the small family, sometimes with his wife Hannah, who looked at the little boy with a tenderness that mirrored the child she and Ethan had never been able to have themselves. Megan, Claire's old friend from the diner, stopped by regularly too, bringing homemade banana bread and laughing about how proud she'd been the day she found out that the quiet, exhausted co-worker with the enormous heart had gotten her happy ending after all. One evening, holding the baby while Claire finally got a full hour to nap, Megan admitted quietly that watching Claire keep going through those brutal weeks had made her go home and finally apply for the nursing program she'd talked about for years and never had the courage to start. She said Claire didn't just get a happy ending for herself. She'd handed one to a few other people too, without even realizing it. And Claire, half asleep on the couch, could only laugh and tell her to stop before she started crying again. Ryan eventually found a new position at a garage that treated him fairly and worked around his healing arm during the last stretch of recovery, while Claire was finally able to stay home and focus on her son without worrying over every single dollar. The friendship between the two families deepened with every shared dinner, every laugh that filled Claire's small house again, a house that finally had room for dreams and plans for what came next. What had begun as a chance encounter in a small snowbound diner had become something none of them ever wanted to let go of, a bond that ran far deeper than simple gratitude. Inspired by everything they'd been through together, Ethan and Ryan started a small nonprofit legal clinic that same year, offering free consultations to workers who'd been let down by their employers the same way Ryan had been. Ethan handled the legal side of things, while Ryan, who understood exactly what it felt like to be dismissed and disbelieved, helped people find the courage to put their own stories into words without being intimidated by the size of the companies they were up against. Within a few months, they'd already helped a handful of families who never would have dared stand up for themselves otherwise, including a young forklift driver from the next county over who'd been denied his own injury claim for nearly identical reasons, and who broke down in relief in Ethan's office the day the case finally settled in his favor. Every success story like that one reminded both of them of exactly how their own had begun, in a small diner on an ordinary snowy morning. It gave the whole thing a purpose that reached far beyond the two of them, and that mattered more than either had expected. A year later, on a crisp afternoon with the first real snow of the season just beginning to fall, Claire, Ryan, Ethan, and Hannah sat together in the small backyard behind Claire and Ryan's new house, celebrating little Ethan's first birthday while he crawled happily across a blanket surrounded by bright balloons. Ryan, his arm fully healed by now, stood by the grill telling everyone proudly about his new role as shop manager, while Claire, who no longer needed to work if she didn't want to, watched her son with eyes that shone with something close to disbelief at how far they'd come. Ethan sat on a bench beside Hannah, holding her hand, both of them watching the little boy with a warmth that needed no words at all, because by now they were simply part of this family, in every way that counted. Walt, the old mechanic who'd once put his career on the line to back Ryan up, sat at the table with a beer in hand, telling Megan how proud he was of the young man he'd watched grow up in that garage over the years. As the first snow of the evening began to drift gently over the yard, everyone laughed and ducked under the porch overhang for cover, and Claire found herself thinking about how a very different kind of falling snow had once brought her together with a stranger who became so much more than just a lawyer. She looked over at Ethan, who had little Ethan up on his shoulders and was making him laugh, and she felt a quiet, steady gratitude that she never once took for granted. Ryan wrapped his arm around her, kissed the top of her head, and murmured that together they'd managed to build something beautiful out of the darkest stretch of their lives. Standing there surrounded by falling snow, laughter, and the people who had become their family, both of them understood that their story was far from finished. Later that night, After the guests had gone home and little Ethan was finally asleep upstairs, Claire stood at the window and watched the snow keep falling under the porch light, steady and unhurried, the same way it always seemed to fall over Pine Brook in the last weeks of the year. She thought about how frightened she'd been of that same kind of snow once, of icy sidewalks and a broken arm and a boss who thought her job was disposable, and how none of it had broken them in the end. Ryan came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her shoulders, and the two of them stood there a long while, without saying anything at all, because some nights didn't need words. In the end, Claire and Ryan understood that it's sometimes the darkest moments in life that bring us the people who end up changing everything, even if we can't see it clearly while we're living through it. One attentive glance, a little genuine compassion, and the courage to trust a complete stranger had turned a family in crisis into a family full of new hope. The snow that had been falling outside the diner windows that very first day was long gone by now, but what remained was the warmth of a friendship none of them ever saw coming. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments what part of Ethan's decision stayed with you the most, and don't forget to subscribe to Winter Vale, because next week another story just like this one will be waiting for you.